Fonts are an essential part of design. Whether it be a brochure, logo, book, or newspaper, the type choice can make or break the design. Sometimes they just do not get their time in the spotlight compared to applications, images, or layouts. Today, we're going to spend the whole time talking about fonts, from design to technology. I'm your host, Brent Haley, from Left Hand Man Productions, and welcome to our Fonts seminar. We have a full agenda today, including an interview with Adobe Systems talking about the latest in font design, font formats and technology inside of Mac OS X, hearing from the leader in font management, Extensis, and how to manage fonts individually and within a creative work group. Let's get started with going to the studio and talking about font formats and how they're working in the current Mac OS. Apple has been the leader in digital publishing for over 20 years. Apple's Mac, Aldus PageMaker, and Adobe's LaserWriter and PostScript language changed the face of designing in digital fonts. The first Mac came with a few fonts, I think including Chicago, Geneva, Times, and Helvetica. Not a lot of choices. Now Mac OS X has updated its fonts capability once again. There's actually no limit to the fonts that you can install, around 7,000 in the system. It comes with 100 font faces containing 188 families. There's a lot more non-Roman language support, about 53 languages, making it really a global OS. And of course they put their own font manager in there, Font Book, and we'll take a look at some of these items. But the biggest change with Mac OS X was its support for Unicode. Now a lot of people don't talk about this, but it's a huge deal for fonts. It really handles a lot of the problems that were still existing with cross-platform compatibility, different encoding in applications from print to web, and it caused characters to really display differently. Now, this standard comes from the Unicode Consortium, a nonprofit organization that specifies how text is represented in the modern software products and standards. Today, the Unicode standard is supported in many operating systems, modern browsers, and many other products. It represents one of the most significant advances in global font technology. Well, what does that really mean to you and I? Well, remember that the Unicode standard defines 65,000 mappings for fonts. So what that means is that the mapping of the letter A will be the same in every single font. That gives the ability for programs to get better predictability for publishing and viewing, not only in print, but over multiple operating systems and multiple programs. But first, we want to talk about font formats and really talk about all the different ones that are located in Mac OS X and what can be used. Now, looking at my system here, I brought out all the font formats that are available inside of Mac OS X and can be used. Now, the first one is what we call a D font, and you'll see that I have Helvetica and Lucida Grande, and that is a data fork true type font. Now this isn't any different than an ordinary Mac TrueType font, except that they are packaged specifically for the Unix system. This information is in the data fork instead of in separate resource forks. Now the next font is a TrueType font. Now we can have a Windows TrueType or a Mac TrueType. It doesn't matter. I have Chalkboard listed here and the extension is TTF. And these examples are actually Windows TrueType fonts. Now, this allows me to actually bring in a Windows TrueType font and support it right in Mac OS X. Great for people who are switching over or maybe have two machines. You can actually use your Windows fonts. Now, there's one exception here. You do not need to copy over the Windows AFM file, because remember when you're on Windows, there are two files. There's this TrueType font and the AFM file. Now, the next font format that we want to look at is PostScript Multiple Master. And you'll see that I have Tecton here, and it's designated with an MM on the back end of the font. Now, it still is a PostScript Type 1 outline font, and I have to have the font suitcase and the actual printer font. And these are designated by an FFIL designation and an LWFN for the printer font. Now, a lot of these were created for a long time, and it was really how Adobe extended past just the PostScript Type 1 fonts. It allowed us to do variations in weight and compression, giving us custom looks known as instances. At this point, there's no way to use these or create new instances. But Mac OS X, if you have legacy ones, do have the ability to work with them and work with any of the instances. Now that leads us over to PostScript Type 1, really the font that started everything. And if you look here, I have Snell Roundhouse. And again, it has two font pieces. The font suitcase, again designated FFIL, and the outline font or the bitmap printer font. And I have three of them inside of that suitcase. Now, like I said, this launched the digital revolution, and it's still probably the most widely used font format today. It does have some limitations, limited to 256 characters. Now, how did we get past this? Well, Mac OS X and Adobe, and like I said, this Unicode consortium really came up with a new font format, OpenType. These are PostScript high-quality fonts. And if you'll notice here at the bottom with Trajan, it has a designation of OTF. And I have the individual fonts, bold and regular, located on my system. Now, these are a single file. It's including the screen font and also the printer font in one file. Type can be set in non-Roman languages, so I can really be global. And like I mentioned, it can contain up to 65,000 glyphs or characters. Now, the other beautiful thing is that these are cross-platform. So Mac OS X uses a lot of different fonts. Let's just talk about it one more time. Again, the D fonts that are used in the system, any true type fonts, Mac or Windows, are PostScript fonts, Type 1, any of our multiple master PostScript fonts in instances, and the brand new font format, OpenType. So it allows us to work with all kinds of different font formats and really gives us the flexibility of working with these fonts. Now, the next thing that we want to talk about in OS X is the location of the fonts. And it's actually a little bit more complicated than we have done in some of the previous systems. And the reason for this is Mac OS X allows us to have multiple users on the same computer. Let's take a look at how we actually organize these on the system. I'm going to close down our font formats and go directly into our hard drive. And the first place to look for fonts is inside of the System folder, going to Library and drilling down into Fonts. You'll notice that I have multiple D fonts located inside of the system, like Keyboard, Last Resort, Lucida Grande. These fonts are the fonts that actually run the system. They draw the display, all the menus, everything that you see on the computer. You don't want to throw these away. Now, there's a few documents that you can go to. We'll show them at the end of the show. One of these is from Extensis, the ability to do font best practices, and it shows you which fonts you can take in or take out. Now, the next place to look for fonts is inside of the Library folder. And go down into our Fonts folder. And you notice I have a lot of different fonts that have been installed. And these, a lot of different formats. I've got TrueType, I've got D fonts, I've got PostScript fonts. Now the Library folder is where everybody accesses the fonts. So if I install an application, they'll probably install it directly into this folder. Now, if you want to actually start with a really clean system and start using font management, you might want to take all of these fonts and take them out. Well, I'm going to create a folder on the desktop called Disabled Fonts. Go back and drag them all out. This doesn't affect anything that's happening inside of Mac OS X because, again, these are for the library or the user or for applications. The system is still going to run great. You might just not have access to some of the fonts that maybe Microsoft Word wants. But you can go ahead and organize those later when you decide on what font management system you want to start using. Now, the third place to look for fonts is actually inside of the individual users. My username right now is Apple. Again, I go into another Library folder and another Fonts folder. And you'll see that I have a lot of different fonts located in here. Now, again, this is where some applications put them in the library, some put them in the user fonts. You can copy them different places. It does get really confusing. But Again, a suggestion, if you really want to start with a clean font system, let's just select all these fonts and drag them out to our disabled fonts folder. And now we don't have anything located in the users, we don't have anything located in the library, and our system fonts are the only fonts that are actually activated. Well, there's actually a few more places. Now, classic fonts. I'm sure all of us remember Mac OS 9, but you know what? If you're running classic, you really should be upgrading your applications and upgrading your OS. Everything out there is running great on OS 10. Creative Suite, Quark Express, all the Microsoft products. So you really don't need to be using classic. And I'm not even going to talk to you about classic fonts. The next area is application fonts. And what do I mean by application fonts? Well, Adobe Creative Suite, if you actually have it, installs a lot of fonts. If I go to the library, Application Support, Adobe, and go to the Fonts folder, look at all these fonts. And as I can scroll down, you can see there are a lot of high-quality fonts. And if you'll notice by the designation, all of these are open-type fonts. These are the latest, greatest fonts available from Adobe. Now, looking down the list, look at Warnock Pro, a great font. Warnock Pro is $199 off the Adobe Type website. I'm sure if you added up all the cost of these fonts, it's probably more than the actual Creative Suite costs. They really should be advertising this. But remember, these fonts are only being activated by Adobe programs. So if you want to have them available to everything in your system, iPhoto, Keynote, all those other applications, you need to move the fonts. Well, to do that, I'm going to create a folder on the desktop called Adobe Fonts. Selecting the top view here, because I don't want to select the Adobe Font 05.lst. That's actually needed to create PDFs. And scrolling down, all the way down to the required folder, that is also something you don't want to remove because, as it says, those are required. But all these other fonts can be moved out of that folder. Now, if we move these over to the Library Fonts folder, it gives access for all of our applications and all of our users to access all of these great Adobe OpenType fonts. But we're going to do that a little bit later when we talk about font book and font management. But now that we have a little bit more of an update on current font format support and locations, let's take a minute to talk to the company that brought PostScript and is working on OpenType fonts to us, Adobe Systems. I'd like to welcome our first guest from Adobe Systems, the company that brought us PostScript and is now bringing us OpenType, David Lemon. David, thank you for joining us here on the show. I really appreciate your time.
It's great to be here.
Great. Well, the first thing, of course, I like to tell our audience is what you do at Adobe and let them know kind of your background.
Well, the simple answer is I manage the type group, and what we do there is design typefaces and turn them into font software. We mostly focus on fonts for European languages, all of them, and we also work closely with a team in Tokyo who design Japanese typefaces.
So what is your background to become a type designer, and kind of how long have you been at Adobe itself?
Well, I started out as a painting student at local art colleges, and I got more and more interested in putting words in my art, and I switched over to graphic design. And I always wanted to do type. I got hooked on it by Jim Parkinson, actually, who was teaching a class at a local junior college. Yeah. He's a fantastic lettering artist who's also done a number of typefaces, some of which are in our library.
Now at Adobe, are there people still, designing fonts, or are you kind of contracting that out? I mean, how does that work today in the digital world?
Well, most of the typefaces in our library are actually licensed from other companies, but for the last 20 years, Adobe has been designing typefaces of our own, and we now have quite a collection that we're really proud of. And we have Robert Slimbach, who's one of the world's best type designers.
Very well known.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I've heard, of course, in the industry that Adobe started with PostScript, kind of really started the revolution of digital type, and now focusing only on OpenType format. Give us an idea of when that transition was made and kind of why, if you can let us know.
Good question. Yeah. Well, the original font format that Adobe developed, called Type 1, was more than 25 years ago now, and it's done a great job, but it's gotten very long in the tooth, and the world has moved ahead. So Adobe got together with Microsoft and co-developed the OpenType font format starting about 8 years ago now. Yeah. And we converted all the fonts in our library over to OpenType and are doing all our new development in OpenType. It's a much more capable format. It allows us to put many more characters in a font, have many glyphs per character, and so it has a lot of other advantages as well. It lets us have a single file that works on both Mac and Windows.
So cross-platform.
And so it's cross-platform. It's great for supporting broad set of languages. The characters are all encoded in Unicode, and it includes intelligence in the font, information that works with layout engines to allow much better default typography.
So with OpenType, has that been a lot more interesting for type designers now that you've moved to that format, because they can include all these characters and all this other stuff
That's
inside
like being
the
in a
font?
candy store, you know. So some type designers have really kind of gone wild with it.
Yeah.
You can do as many variations on a design as you want. Adobe tries to pioneer this, but there are a number of other designers out there who are doing some pretty cool stuff with it too.
So now you don't have to be worried about just having, okay, that's your capital, that's it, and I can't do any other variations. Now they can do all kinds of crazy stuff, swashes, and all kinds. It's awesome. I'm sure that helps a lot of creatives too. They can get a little bit more interesting designs.
Yeah, it's a lot more possibility for expression.
Now, you mentioned again with OpenType, it's cross-platform, Windows and Mac. Now, when you are designing a typeface, do you consider the platform? I mean, is there any need to these days?
No.
Not at all?
No, we just, it's important to focus on how well the fonts work, say, on screen, for example, but as well as in printed output. But the platform environment really doesn't matter.
And the application, of course, Adobe is a cross-platform company for Windows and Mac applications. No need to worry there. They just plug right into the applications, whether you're working on Windows or Mac.
Most of our applications are pretty much the same on both Mac and Windows.
Great. Now, multiple master. Just have to ask this question. I know we had Type 1 and then multiple master. It's still around, and I have some in my library, of course, and I've created my own instances and done some creative designs, and I can still work with that on Mac OS X. But there's no way to create an instance these days right now in any applications, right? Because that's kind of gone.
Right.
So you'd have to kind of go back in time, create an instance, and then move forward again.
Yeah, a lot of us were pretty disappointed at that multiple master didn't ever fully catch on. But when we were developing OpenType, it became clear that we couldn't really carry that forward and go forward with OpenType at the same time.
Now, I can go out on the web, and I know that there's a lot of designers out, and I can go out and buy thousands of fonts on a CD for a pretty inexpensive price. So how do you guys really talk to designers, and what are the differences of buying an Adobe design face or an Adobe typeface?
Well, what Adobe does particularly well, I think, is really sophisticated and subtle text families. We have some pretty awesome display designs as well. The stuff that we're doing it has depth and breadth that you simply don't get in the cheap stuff.
The little fonts. So I mean, so if I buy an Adobe font, I'm going to get a lot more variant. I'm going to get a lot more of the swashes, and you guys put a lot more time in the actual face, and not just give me okay, here's your alphabet, we're done, and give me your 1995.
We also have what I really do believe is the best quality control in the industry. I'm very proud of our Type QE team.
And is it a large team? I mean, is it?
No, the entire department, there's just 9 of us. So everybody wears multiple hats.
Yeah. And everybody's been there a pretty long time and is totally into fonts, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Well, we have one guy who's been with us only a year, but that's unusual.
Yeah.
Most people more than 10.
Fantastic. Great. For type trends, I mean, I was into the Ray Gun magazine and kind of the grunge scene with fonts for a while, and all the movies that we're doing, all the great trailers. Yeah, David Carson, who's an awesome designer. What do you see as the trends, and what are you guys doing kind of in the next wave of fonts that you guys see coming out in the industry?
What I see is a real emphasis on the quality of handwork. What we saw in the last 5 to 10 years was a real emphasis on, well, I can make things look kind of like handwriting or hand lettering or so forth, and I think some of that will continue, and OpenType really opens a lot of new possibilities for making that more natural. But our text designs as well have very subtle hand quality to them. They don't look mechanistic.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a warmth that comes through that's really important to people in that.
So we're going to get a little bit more personal almost. I mean, people creating their own web pages, their own movies, and now fonts are going to have that more of that flow to them, not, the block style and kind of going in that direction.
Yeah, there are always cases where people want to have a technical kind of look, the overblown bitmaps or whatnot, and there's certainly plenty of stuff for that too. But I think that the human element is what's really most important.
Good. I'm looking forward to seeing some of the new stuff you guys are coming out with.
Well, we are coming out. We continue to design new faces. These days, maybe about 2 families a year, and we've got a new typeface family from Robert called Arno.
That's brand new.
Named after the river in Florence, because it's sort of Italian in feel. And that's going to be bundled with the next release of the Creative Suite. And we also have another new design from another guy in our group, his first, which will be available as a registration incentive for people who buy the Creative Suite or many of the Point products.
Do you know the name of the font? Can we?
Yeah, it's called Ipatia.
Ipatia, great. First probably that people are going to hear about this, so that's fantastic. And that leads to a question. I have CS2, and you guys bundle a lot of fonts in CS2. Are you going to continue that trend? Because, I mean, that's a lot of great value in that product that I don't think people, and we talk about it in the show here, but people don't realize the cost savings that they're doing to start getting all those fonts in the product.
Yeah, the fonts may be worth more than the apps. Yeah. No, we think that it's a very important value add. And we work closely with the many of the application teams to get good typographic behaviors in the applications. And so it's only natural to include typefaces that help support those. And
awesome.
let people really take full advantage of it.
So Arno is going to be brand new in CS3, and hopefully we'll see a few other things coming out in the next year.
Yeah.
And I have to ask you, what is your favorite font?
Well, I can't really narrow it down to one, but I'm a big fan of Robert Slimbach's designs, and I use several of his for various purposes. I think some of them are maybe under-noticed and underappreciated. I particularly like Warnock Pro, for example, which has kind of an edgy quality to it.
Free in CS2. I mean, comes inside the product. It's usually $199 if you buy it on the web, so great value. Well, David, I want to thank you for your time and a lot of the great information that you gave myself and our audience. We really appreciate it. Well, that was David Lemon from Adobe Systems, and he gave us some inside information. Brand new font available from Robert Slimbach in Creative Suite 3 called Arno. And another font that you should look out for, Ipatia, from one of their brand new designers, maybe as a registration incentive or something else, but make sure you go to adobe.com/type. You get some more information there and keep up to date on what they're doing in font technologies. And now let's take some time and go to the studio, and we're going to look at macOS 10 capabilities and technologies and see some of the fonts that are available in Adobe CS2. Well, that was great talking with Adobe Systems, and we've kind of talked about font formats and locations, but now let's go over some of the operating systems technologies they put in for font management and multiple languages, because we really want to know how to access them. Well, the first place to look inside is the System Preferences. Now, you wouldn't think this, but it's under the International tab. And inside the Input menu, it allows us to select multiple keyboard layouts, input methods, and palettes, like the character palette or the keyboard viewer. And as I mentioned, we can go ahead and support over 53 languages in macOS 10. So as I scroll down, I can get those different input methods. Simplified Chinese. Maybe I want to go and do Armenian. And as we scroll down, you'll see all the different languages that we can actually support and start working with. And I'm going to bring up the one that I like working with. Let's bring up Hebrew and close this down. And you'll notice inside of the top menu bar, all of these are actually located and we can start working with them. Now, I don't have a keyboard that handles International or Hebrew, but if I click on showing the keyboard viewer, it brings up the actual Hebrew keyboard. So now as I type, you can see that I actually have a visual of what's going on with my keyboard. So really cool technology to start working with it. Now I can also show the character palette. Now as I mentioned with Unicode, there's a direct mapping of every single character in every font. Now that means that sometimes we'll lose character variations, or what we used to call dingbats or extra characters, because there is an actual standard now. So how do we access some of those things? Well, inside the character palette, this is where we can access some of the things we might not find, including miscellaneous dingbats, some of the current currency, say euro, that I can grab, and I can bring this over to my favorites. Say I want to add it over to my favorites. So now I always have a list of all the current dingbats that I always use. And this is just a way that we can actually have multiple access. Now, even better than this stuff is working with fonts or the font panel. Now, OS X is actually built in a font panel. Now, applications like InDesign, Illustrator, Quark Express have their own font panel look and feel. Now, that's great, and we use those applications a lot, but what about when we use Mail, TextEdit, Keynote, iWeb, iPhoto, or any of the iLife products? Well, each one of those applications actually accesses the same technology, the font panel. And it creates a consistent user experience across all the applications, and it allows us to get access to all of that font information. I'm going to bring up iPhoto. Now, you wouldn't think I'd be using iPhoto and text a lot, but I've got some pictures of my son, and I'm going to create a book. Create a small picture book. I'm just going to drag a photo in. Now I've got the title of a book, and here's where my text comes in. I'm going to bring up the font panel or show fonts. Now you notice I have all the fonts that are located in my system. Now these can be accessed in any one of those font folders, of course, inside of System or Users or Library. And I'm going to bring up Papyrus font and have my Quinn photos, and I'm going to do some caps here. March 07, get rid of the word book. But now I want to actually see what else I have inside of that font. Now inside of the font panel, I can bring up the typography panel. And it shows me the large caps or the ligatures that I can actually work with. So for example, I'm going to select I want the alternate large capitals, because with Unicode, as we talked about, I can have 65,000 different characters. It allows me to have different caps, different characters, different ligatures, different glyphs, all this cool stuff in the font. And I can access directly from the typography panel. So anything you want to do, you can go ahead and access that right in here. And this is available to every single program that's on the Mac. Now, this also allows us, and let's go back into some of our photos, and I'm just going to select a few of these photos, and I'm going to go to iWeb and create a photo page. And I'm going to directly to the web. Now, a lot of people go to my iWeb web page and they go, hey, your fonts look great. They're cool. I'm on Windows. I can actually see all this cool stuff. Aren't you supposedly, limited only a few fonts? Well, again, most browsers out there are Unicode compliant. Windows, Mac OS, Netscape, all of those are actually working with Unicode. So now if I select, and as you can see, I'm missing some of the fonts that were actually inside of this template. But again, I go to fonts, and now I get the same font panel. If I want to bring in a script font, let me bring up the size a little bit to 72. Maybe I want to change the day at the beach to a nicer font than that. Maybe I want to start using Myriad Pro all over the place. I go ahead and start working with different font sizes. I want to bring it a little bit smaller. And this is actually put directly into the web page. So you can go crazy. Most browsers out there will recognize the font structures and display correctly. Now, anything done inside of the font panel is reflected in FontBook, the OS built-in font manager. Let's close down iWeb and iPhoto, and let's bring up our FontBook program. Go into Application. It actually is an application, and open it up. Now, as I open it up, you'll notice that I have all the fonts location. I can look at the user. Now, remember, we took all the fonts out of the user location. So now it says off. If I put it in the user location, which we'll do in a minute, it'll actually turn those on. And then I can look at all the fonts that are located in my computer or my system. You'll see, again, Warnock Pro. I moved these over directly from the Adobe library folder, so now I have access to them to all of my fonts, and I can actually work with them. There's a few other things inside of FontBook that you can work with. It has validation of fonts. You can drag and drop and double-click on the desktop, and it'll automatically add them into your fonts. Now, with FontBook, with preferences, it also allows us to put them in the default location user or computer. Let's grab in some of our fonts. I'm just going to double click them and install the fonts. You'll notice that in FontBook, it's automatically installed all of the faces of that family. Now, for creative professionals who have mass amounts of fonts and need management from individual workstations to creative work groups, it is best that we take some time and invite our next guest, Extensis, the #1 developer of font management tools for the creative industry. Now, I'd like to introduce my second guest on the show today, Brian Burson, the founder of Diamondsoft. And Diamondsoft and Extensis merged a while back into a huge powerhouse of font technology and font management. So I'm really excited to have him here with us today to talk about some of their new products. Brian, thanks for joining us.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Appreciate it. So first, of course, my question to every one of my guests is kind of letting our audience know, what you do at Extensis now, and
Sure.
kind of what's going on.
Sure. Actually, I'm general manager of Extensis now, which pretty much means I'm responsible for mostly everything that goes on in the company. I'm responsible for financial results. I'm responsible for strategic direction and tactical direction. Pretty much the buck stops here.
Good deal. Good deal. And as we mentioned, you were the founder of Diamondsoft and merged with Extensis, and two powerhouses in font technology really merging together. How has that merger and consolidation been going in some of the products?
Other than taking much longer than any of us expected it to take at the outset, I think right now it's actually going quite well. We released our Suitcase Fusion product a little over a year ago now, and that was sort of the first merging of those two technologies on the standalone side. So that's done, but that was a simple part of the equation. The much more complex side is the client-server technology, and we're in development of that right now. There were some very stringent requirements going into that. If you can imagine, we've got these two fairly mature products with large customer bases, and they sort of took a different tact to how they did their server-based font management. So figuring out how to bring them together without losing sort of the value proposition for any of our customers, that was a tough thing. It got our product managers and engineers really thinking there. But we're through that, and we're moving forward now. Things are looking good.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I mean, it was I was definitely a fan of both companies and used both products all the time, as you know. And Fusion's been out for about a year, and that, like you said, that's a merger of those two technologies.
Right. It's basically, it took the the great easy user experience from the Suitcase side, and it put in a lot of the deeper font reserve technologies, and a lot of that is under the hood. People may not even realize that they're in the product. Things like face level activation, the concept of a vault, a repository where all your fonts get stored, even in a standalone sort of local environment. And FontSense technology is one of the big ones that also came across. So yeah, a lot of that work on the client side, on the standalone side, has been done now.
You mentioned FontSense, and that's a huge piece, and just explain to our audience what that actually means, because I know a lot of people know about fonts and the name of a font, but I don't think they go in depth on what is inside that font.
Well, basically what it comes down to is that there are two basic problems in the industry that we've been facing from the beginning of the desktop publishing era, and that is one, applications like Adobe InDesign or Quark Express, when they save out a document that uses a font that you've been using, they basically save the name of the font only. So when you reopen that document, it looks for that Bauhaus bold, and as long as it finds a Bauhaus bold, it goes happily along its way. The other part of the problem, though, is Helvetica is not Helvetica is not Helvetica. We know that there are multiple versions of fonts, and what can happen, often does happen, is that the wrong version of the font happens to be active at the time you reopen that document. And so you have problems like reflow problems and things like that. What FontSense technology is all about is sort of a fingerprinting or an IDing of a font, so that you get sort of a unique way of looking at every particular font. And that unique ID essentially is then stamped into the document, so that when you reopen a document, it knows not only that it's Bauhaus bold, but exactly which version of Bauhaus bold you need.
So that's being integrated. I mean, again, we talk about working with the large applications we do on a daily basis. So you guys are actually really integrated with applications, not just a standalone font manager and we deal with your fonts. I mean, you're integrated with Illustrator and InDesign and Quark
Font management has come a long way since the 1980s, when you used to just point at a font and turn it on, and that was what font management was all about. No, it's really about workflows now, and that's what we're all about at Extensis, is workflows.
Yeah, because one of the biggest things, I mean, the cost of a product could be, getting a wrong re-ragging of type or the wrong font in a print job could, that's a huge cost for a lot of people.
Absolutely, and this is what it's all about.
So you mentioned that you have other products, and the server thing is a huge deal. And I think a lot of people in the creative arts industry, they have their individual computer, they have their individual fonts, and they deal with it on a daily basis. But talk a little about serving technology. I mean, that's in creative work groups, and I mean, when should someone really start looking at working with serving technology?
In my mind, when you're at about 5 people in your organization, and certainly moving up from there, you really need to be considering a server-based font manager. There are a lot of aspects of font management that may not be evident to you when you're just thinking about turning fonts on and off. But you want to make sure that everyone in the organization is using the right fonts at the right time, and that they have access to the fonts that they need. What you don't want is, someone sitting at their desk saying, "Hey, Joe, do you have that Helvetica?" And, them sort of emailing you fonts and things like that, because that's when fonts sort of get out of control and you start getting reflows, you start getting corruption, and things come to a halt. So sort of managing that whole thing is a big deal, and one of the huge benefits of server-based font management. Of course, the other one is all about font compliancy. Yeah. Fonts are intellectual property. They are licensed, and being compliant with your fonts is becoming more and more important every day in corporations. And without some sort of server-based font management, you're pretty much dead in the water.
Now, we're not going to see anything like, the record labels coming down on iTunes like that with fonts, but, compliancy is very important, especially for corporations
That's
and
right.
even for internal designers.
Absolutely. I mean, in general, people are paying a lot more attention to it. The whole Sarbanes-Oxley thing, fonts are certainly way down on the ladder there, but it's all about compliancy. It's about, legal use of what you own,
Exactly.
what you're licensing.
Now with servers, and I know this scares a lot of creative professionals, right? You say the word server and, they kind of turn off because, that's an IT, it's not a creative thing. But when we talk about servers, I mean, that can be, it doesn't have to be an Xserve G5 in a cold room with, an IT guy. I mean, a server can be other, pieces of equipment, right?
That's right. What it comes down to is that the creatives and the end users shouldn't feel... shouldn't really even know the difference whether the fonts are being served to them or they're local on their machine. It should feel like they have access to everything they need access to, and they can do the things that are important for them. They can do their searches by classification or preview their fonts, to make the selections that they want. At the end of the day, what is important is that when they reopen a document that was created previously, that the right fonts are there and they don't need to be thinking about it or looking for it or anything like that. So the whole purpose of a server-based solution is not to get in the way of creatives, but to stay out of the way. But basically to give them what they need when they need it, so that they don't need to be, going around searching for things.
Now with work groups, of course, it's a global community now. It's not as much, 5 designers sitting in a room and everybody's always in that room. Is there anything that Extensis is working with or kind of in their future technologies on, dealing with this globalization of creatives? I'm working with Bob and he's in Japan and, it doesn't matter where I am, but we're kind of all working on the same thing.
Well, this gets back to the heart of why this sort of integration of the Suitcase and Font Reserve technologies on the server side is taking a while. We have customer bases and we have customers out there that have literally thousands of users on multiple servers, and we're trying to make sure that we're managing their expectations as well as the small 10-user creative design shop. We don't want to come out with a product that's not going to work for the 10-user shop, but at the same time we do need to support the thousands of users. So that's sort of built into the whole development framework, what it is we're coming out with.
That's tough. I mean, that's tough to span that. That's a huge customer base.
It is tough, and we're trying to do something more than Font Reserve and Suitcase together. We want to get to the next level, so we are using a lot of open technologies and things that are going to provide us a platform basically to build on top of moving forward.
Moving forward for the next few years.
Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, I'm glad you guys have merged, and I'm looking forward to the server one.
That's very exciting.
And I've used Fusion, and it's been fantastic product, and merging those technologies together. I have to ask the question. Of course, I'm mostly a designer working on Mac. You have a product, Fusion, Windows and Mac. I mean, anything that you guys are doing, different? I mean, Vista's out. We kind of have OS 10, doing a rev here soon. Anything to say about Windows versus Mac and what's going on?
Honestly, we are seeing a huge pickup on the Windows side. When I joined Extensis about 3.5-4 years ago, Windows was less than 2%, honestly, of the font management side of the business, and it's growing quite dramatically. So I think it's still Mac savvy, and the Mac is still the graphics platform. There's no doubt about that. But you see in the larger publishing organizations where it's not all about creative, you're starting to see a lot more Windows infiltration there. So
more on the corporate side, or
on the corporate side, absolutely on the corporate side.
Interesting. Well, I think font management might just becoming more of an issue too. I mean, people are actually, instead of just doing what you have to do and just placing your font somewhere, they're actually buying a product to do font management, which is great because they really should be doing that.
It gets into the compliancy issues and the organizational issues and all of that as well.
So just a question. We talked with Adobe earlier. OpenType.
Yes.
I mean, it's fantastic with Unicode, fantastic technology that allows us to really do a lot more with fonts. Anything that you guys have done with that or running into with OpenType?
From my perspective, OpenType is great simply because you don't have the cross-platform issues, and it's a single file. And from a typography standpoint, obviously David talked about all the great things that OpenType gives you. From a workflow perspective, that's where OpenType really shines. You know, you can just take that font that you've been using on the Mac in your InDesign file and transfer it over to the production side that might be on Windows in the InDesign file, and you don't have any issues.
You're off and running.
So from that point of view, it's great. There's there's nothing special we have to do. It's another file format that we handle inside our font managers. I'm looking forward to the day where we can get rid of some of the older technologies and just streamline everything.
Now, how about Classic? I mean, we got a lot of Mac users, of course. Now, I talk about Classic, and I don't use it anymore because I really don't have any need for it.
Yeah,
but
I think we've moved on.
Thank God, right?
We're done with. I think we're done with Classic. I think
there.
Apple has done a tremendous job, getting everyone migrated over, and I think we're practically there.
Fantastic. And I always have to ask all of my guests, do you have, because we're on a font chart, do you have a favorite font that you like using on a daily basis?
People think because I've been in fonts for the last 15 or 20 years of my life that I must be a real font expert. And the fact is I'm not. I'm not a typography expert. My expertise is in workflows. And fonts are just one of the assets that we like to manage, in our workflows. So, but I do have an appreciation for type. I mean, over the years, you kind of pick that up.
It rubs off on you.
I have an affinity to Officina, which I think is a font that we used actually in the branding of Font Reserve way back when, and it's just a very versatile font. It can be used in so many different ways. So, lovely font.
Yeah, that's a great answer. A great answer. Well, Brian, I want to thank you for your time. It's always good to see you.
Thanks, Brent. I enjoyed it.
Appreciate you coming down and giving some of the information and some kind of the vision of what is happening at Extensis and in the next generation of products that you guys are coming out with.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank again our guest from Extensis, Brian Burson. And before we move on, let's do a review of the current offerings of products that Extensis has for font management. Now, Extensis offers a full range of products for font management, starting with the individual user, Suitcase Fusion for the Mac platform. And this is the first time, as we talked with Brian, that they're actually integrating technology from Diamondsoft and Extensis into a font management product. Now, if you're working on Windows, you can get Suitcase for Windows. And this is now available for Vista. And it's also the first Windows product that allows you to do auto activation for your graphic apps, including InDesign and Quark Express. Now, if you're a creative work group, say anyone from 5 people to thousands, you probably want to start talking about server font management. Now, we talked with Brian, and that's the next generation of products that Extensis is working on, really merging their technologies of the products they currently offer. Suitcase Server, which is developed for the smaller work groups, 5 to 20 people. Or Font Reserve Server, a little bit more robust on the technology for the server side, really for the larger corporations or multi-divisions. So we have a full range all the way from the individual user, either platform, all the way to the large corporations with thousands of seats. So let's take some time and go up to the studio and look at some of the features and the technologies inside these products. If you're an individual creative professional and you need to have font management, I really would recommend looking at Extensis' new product, which we've talked about, Suitcase Fusion. And as we mentioned, it is the merge of 2 programs, technologies from Diamondsoft and technologies from Extensis. Let's show a little bit of that. Well, I bring up Suitcase Fusion, and you notice it has the elegant interface of Suitcase that we love. Now, it also has some other things that came over from Diamondsoft. If we look inside the preferences, it allows us to copy added fonts into the vault. Now, what is the vault? It's a secure place that allows us to bring all of the fonts inside of Suitcase Fusion. It checks for corruption, it checks for duplication, and then it keeps all those fonts directly inside the system. So you don't have to worry about throwing things away and deleting fonts. So I'm going to close up my preferences. And one of the great things about Fusion is I also have the ability to just drag and drop. So I'm going to grab in a few OpenType fonts, my corporate fonts, Futura, and I'm just going to drag it on a set that I've already created. It's going to import them, it's going to check to make sure they're good for no corruption, and I can now see that actual font. And I can look, get an idea what that font looks like. Now, going back to the desktop, I'm just going to grab a whole folder of fonts and drag it into my sets pane. It's going to bring in all of those fonts. It's going to name that set the same that actual folder was on the desktop. And now I have all of these PostScript fonts located in the system. And all these are available to me, and I can start working with them. Now, they haven't been activated yet. They're sitting inside the application, and they're located in the vault. Now, another great thing about Suitcase Fusion is its auto activation. And it actually developed plugins for InDesign, Illustrator, and Quark Express. Let's take a look at those. Opening up InDesign, I go into Preferences, down to the Suitcase Fusion Auto Activation prefs. And I can enable or disable the Fusion Auto Activation. Well, the first button, Enable Font Sense. Now, that's interesting. What is Font Sense? It's actually a technology by Extensys that allows us to auto-activate fonts, not just by the name. Most applications out there, when you type in the font or typeset all of your files, and you close them and reopen on another computer or another system, it only looks for the name. Now, Font Sense looks for the foundry, it looks for the ID, it gives you an exact match to that font. It's actually a fingerprinting of font. Now, I can do this in InDesign or Illustrator, and really easy to auto-activate. Now I'm going to close down and hide Suitcase Fusion. One of the other things that is really great about Suitcase Fusion is that I can actually activate fonts directly from the dock just by clicking, and now that's activated till restart on all of those fonts. And if I go back to the interface, you'll see that I have an activation light on all of these fonts that I'm working with. And I can turn off fonts individually or within suitcases and just turn off an individual suitcase font or suitcase set. So if you're a creative professional and need to start doing font management, I really would recommend looking at Extensys' new product, Suitcase Fusion. As you can see, fantastic way to start managing fonts. Now, if you're a creative work group, 3 people and above maybe, you might want to start thinking about font server management. Now, we talked a little bit about this with Brian, and they have 2 products currently available. The Suitcase Server product, and that actually is not administered and has a client with Fusion. It's actually their other product, Suitcase 11. A little bit different, but they're working right now on the next generation of products to bring out their servers. Now, if you are a larger work group, say a publishing house or a corporate agency, you might want to look at Font Reserve Server. This is a little bit more in detail with a database, might need more of an IT person, but definitely a great font manager. So we've got a lot of choices to start working with font management. Now, let's leave on a little bit lighter note and show some other cool stuff. First of all, let's look at the Extensys website, and you'll see right here on the front page, I have that Font Management OS 10 Best Practices Guide, and it's a free download. I would really recommend that you download that and start looking at it. And of course, we talked with Adobe, and we look at their Adobe Fonts page, and you get an open type tour and see some of the new fonts that they're coming out with. Great things to look at. Now, even better and even more fun, let's look at some of the brand new widgets that you can download for fonts. We've got the Font Finder, allows me to find all the different fonts that are currently out there by name, author, or foundry. Say I want to do Adobe. It's going to go out and find the Adobe type library and bring me to that for the Font Foundry. Or I can go to Typophile, which is a blog that allows me to see all the cool things about what people are saying about fonts. Or I can look at our font viewer. So I can type in and put it in any one of my different fonts and see what that's going to look like, maybe bold. So really cool little fun stuff if you want to go ahead and start working with fonts. If you're crazy about type like me, I am sure you enjoyed our seminar. I want to thank again my guests, David Lemon from Adobe Systems and Brian Burson from Extensys. I'm Brent Haley from Left Hand Man Productions, and I enjoyed being your host for Fonts seminar. View other current and upcoming seminars at our Now Playing area at lefthandman.com.